G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And as this election year gets underway in the United States, here's an uncomfortable question for you. Is one of the presidential candidates a criminal? And if he is a criminal, will the courts find him as such and sentence him as such this year? If not, when could they? When might they? What exactly is the shape of Donald Trump's legal woes? Is it all a partisan witch hunt, as he portrays it? Or is there a there? Or are some of the cases ones in which there's a there, and others in which it probably is a little bit of a witch hunt? I want to untease all this. I want to unpack it. I want to understand what's going to happen this year and whether Donald Trump will ever go to jail. What if he loses the election? Like, then what happens? Could Joe Biden commute his sentence? Like, let's actually play out. Let's understand what he's being accused of and play out what might be about to happen, because we're in uncharted waters here. I mean, this is supremely weird to be going into an election where one of the candidates faces 4 criminal charges. There's no one better in the world to understand all this stuff than Elie Honig. Elie was a mob prosecutor. He fought the mafia in New York for years. From 2004 to 2012, he was the assistant United States attorney at the Southern District of New York, which is the court in New York. I mean, the part of the justice system that most addresses itself to the crimes of the mob, because they're in that neck of the woods. And he specifically prosecuted organized crime. He became the co-chief of the organized crime unit at the Southern District of New York, and he convicted over 100 members of the American mafia. He now is a legal analyst for CNN, so you see his face all over the place. He's the senior legal analyst at CNN since 2018. So he brings this depth of experience that he has about how organized crime works and about how the heads of crime rings are able to evade the justice system when so many people under them fall prey to it. And he can sort of superimpose that understanding onto what's going on in Trumpistan. It's fascinating. Yeah, I really enjoyed his book about all of this and about the relationship between organized crime and the way that rich and powerful people who are outside of organized crime, whether that's you regard that as being Donald Trump or whether you regard it as being Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein or whatever, how they managed to evade capture for so long. The book is called Untouchable. Please enjoy this conversation with the one and only Elie Honig.
I have an Australian relevant thing to raise with you.
Oh, good. Well, tell me about it now. We'll cut into this whenever we.
Oh, you want to talk? Okay, we'll start.
Yeah, let's start.
So I've never been to Australia.
Yeah.
I do have a couple friends there, but I'm right in the middle of reading the true history of the Kelly gang about Ned Kelly, which I read 20 years ago, but all I remember was it was great, and so I'm rereading it now, and it's so Australian, right? Have you ever read it?
I've never read it. No.
Yeah,
do you want to tell American listeners who Ned Kelly is?
So Ned Kelly is sort of just a gangster, basically. I mean, not to minimize him, but it's set in the 1870s, I guess, a little bit after the American Civil War. There's a couple references to how there was the prior decade, there was the American Civil War, and it's in what I guess you would call, I don't know, the bush or the range of Australia when it was sort of wild and unsettled, and it's kind of Wild West, but Australian. And the thing that there's so much about it, I mean, it's a great story, but it's based on the actual diaries written by Ned Kelly. They found, old weathered pieces of parchment or whatever they wrote on, and it's written in his voice. It's fiction, but it's based on his diaries, and it's written, I forget the name of the author, but he's a genius. It's written in from the mouth of Ned Kelly, and so it's not grammatically correct, and there's no punctuation, but it doesn't, I would hate a book like that if you told me that. but it doesn't throw you off at all. It's riveting. It's like, so I'm like mentally in this Australian frame of mind.
So your 19th century Australian criminal history knowledge is probably better than my own. I should be peppering you with questions about outback bush rangers in the 1800s.
Listen, there are some parallels. I mean, the way seriously, like, we'll talk about it, but there are scenes where the cops are trying to flip people against each other and all that.
Yeah, crazy. I've just noticed if people are watching the YouTube video instead of listening to the podcast, the shade of my face is approximately the same as a beetroot, or maybe a tomato, maybe an overripe tomato at the moment.
You look like you just got sun.
I'm only slightly sunburned, but there's something about here. Let me see if this light. I think this light has different shades on it. Oh, look! Now I look like a blue. I got a new fancy light. Oh, now I look like more of a beetroot.
Oh yeah, now you look. Yeah,
and now I look.
For the record, I haven't seen the sun in 4 months.
Yeah. This is one of the liabilities of living in the northeast of the United States. Although I was just over there and there was no snow at Christmas, and I was very disappointed that we didn't get a white Christmas.
Like, I'm starting to wonder whether it even snows here anymore, because it used to snow 3-4 times every winter when I was a kid. Now it's like every 4 years we get 3 inches, and it's changed. I think it's genuinely changed. So, yeah.
And it's that's the worst, because if you're gonna bother being cold, then I at least want it to be fun.
Agreed.
Agreed. I want it to be snowy. I'd rather it be minus 15 Celsius than
this
5 degrees and just sort of drizzly and slushy. So let's talk organized crime and let's talk Donald Trump. Your book is an interesting snapshot from a time a snapshot of time when Donald Trump hadn't been charged with anything, and your frustration kind of oozes through every page, which I assume has changed now. Can we just start with, like, if you were a betting man, what are the odds at the moment that Donald Trump actually ends up seeing jail time for something?
So I'll answer your odds question in a second. When I wrote this book, I say we because I had researchers and, I think of it as a team. But when we wrote this book, it had to, when you write a book, it has to lock at a certain point, and then it publishes 4 months later or something, because they got to send it off to the actual printer. And so we had to lock this.
So old school, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I love they have to shred the trees and then
they do. I mean, it's crazy.
Tree
and by the way,
bits.
You would think that every one of the major publishers, and I wrote this book for HarperCollins, which is one of the 3 major publishers, you would think they all have their own printing presses. Not at all. There's like 3 printing presses in the whole country, and they all have to like reserve space and rent them. But so we locked this book in late 2022, and it published in early January 2023, as you say, at a point when Trump had not been charged. And yes, my frustration is oozing in there, but I do say in the book, by the time you, fair reader, are holding this book, he probably will have been charged probably more than once or something to that effect. And I sort of forecast, I will say not everything I forecast in the book comes true, but a hell of a lot of it has come true. As we stand right now, Trump has 4 criminal indictments against him here in the United States, 2 federal, 2 state. It looks, okay, let me sort of take some things off the table. He will not be physically locked up before the election in November. That is not going to, I know it's a little bit of a fantasy that's out there, because in order for that to happen, he has to not just be convicted, which could well happen, sentenced to prison, which could well happen, but generally speaking, judges here are going to give a person in his scenario, first-time offender, what we call bail pending appeal, meaning he doesn't, even if he's sentenced to X years in prison, he doesn't begin serving that sentence until after he's exhausted all of his appeals, which will take, a year, 2 years. So even if we have this dramatic moment in this spring or summer where some jury says we find the defendant Donald Trump guilty, that will matter a lot. But he's not going to be behind bars in November of this year when the election happens. So let's take that one off the table. How many trials are actually going to happen? There's a whole game of, we can get into this if you want, but a whole game of sort of dominoes and delay tactics by Trump and speeding up tactics by the prosecutors. But it looks like 1 or 2 will happen before the election. The most important one is the Jack Smith, the federal case involving January 6th, which is sort of being fought about the trial date right now. Then there's the hush money payments case, which might happen as well. But that's, I think, by far the least serious and the least likely to have a major impact on the election. Then there's the classified documents case, which indications seem to be that it's likely to move out past the trial. And then there's the Georgia Fulton County DA's case, which also has to do with stealing the 2020 election. That one is not happening before the election. That one you can put off to the side. The DA has asked for a trial, not seriously, a trial date in August, which ain't happening. There's not going to be a criminal trial in August, September, October, November, December, when we have an election in November. That one for now is just for show. So I think we'll see one or two of those other ones.
And just to clarify, you said that there are 2 federal cases and 2 state cases.
Right.
The President of the United States can quash either of the federal cases or can pardon anyone convicted by either of those federal cases, but not the state ones?
So one of the fears that some people have, and I think I understand this, is if Trump wins the election, which right now is, a 50-50 proposition, if that happens, in my view, all 4 of these cases are dead. The president can, forget about pardoning. That's controversial. We don't actually know if a president can pardon himself. It's never been tried. It's not squarely addressed. But I think he will pardon himself. And if he does, by the way, who's going to challenge it? Not his own DOJ, right? Remember, DOJ is under the executive branch, the federal executive branch. And B, he will just order his...
Just to pause on that for a moment, could someone else find standing to challenge that?
I mean, that's a great question. Someone will certainly try. I don't know who other than DOJ would have standing to say,
what about a potential presidential candidate?
I don't think that's enough for standing. I mean, what would be the basis of I've been harmed, right? That's basically what you have to show to harmed in some legally cognizable way. That's interesting. Let me think about this.
Well, I mean, couldn't a potential Republican rival claim that the fact that the person is still in the White House gives them an incumbent edge that they wouldn't have if they were behind bars?
But there's a practical problem here, which is Trump wouldn't be able to pardon himself until he already wins and retakes office.
I see.
So then we're into 2025. He's in his second term anyway.
Wait, why can't he pardon himself in his first term?
Well, his first term's already over. He's not in office. You can only pardon yourself.
I see what you're saying. Right. Yeah.
So
he can't run again.
You can only pardon yourself while you're in office. He did not do that during his first term. There's the self-pardon scenario would be he wins again in November, retakes office in January 2025, and then does it. The other thing he'll do that's more direct, though, is he'll just order his new DOJ. If he retakes the White House in January 2025, he'll say, okay, Attorney General, dismiss this. Or he'll make it a condition of the job. So the 2 federal cases will die if that happens. As for the 2 state cases, there's kind of a way you can parse some of the old constitutional findings that, well, maybe they're different. But I mean, he can't pardon himself, but there's no practical way that the federal courts and the federal government will permit a state and county level prosecutor to try and potentially imprison the sitting president. I mean, that's no different than if some county prosecutor in name your county, Mississippi right now indicted Joe Biden and said, I want to try him, while he's in office and potentially lock him up. That just because of principles of federalism, that the federal government sort of reigns supreme over the state. There's no way that that'll happen. So I think best case scenario...
Well, it'll be good to see some constitutional conservatives who say that they're so committed to states' rights and federalism come out and defend the right of the states to
there's been a bit of flipping
do their
both
own
ways.
thing.
Yeah, there's been a bit of flipping both ways as to who's for states' rights and who's for federal rights. But the best case scenario for the 2 state cases, if Trump wins, is they get put on hold until he's out of office in 2029, by which point he's going to be, God knows, 82 years old, and these cases will be ancient, and who knows where we'll be at that point.
Can you pause a case like that?
So that's another interesting issue, right? Because the statute of limitation, but the statute of limitations is based on when you indict. What Trump would say, let's say it's 2029, we're really getting it. This is great. Trump makes all the hypotheticals come true. Let's say he wins, it's 2029, and the Manhattan DA says, I still want to try him. He's out of office now. I think Trump would say, my basic good faith rights to a speedy trial have now lapsed, and it's been too long. And I think the prosecutors will go, yeah, but not through our fault. I mean, you're the one who dodged trial. You're the one who then hid behind the presidency. I just don't see a realistic scenario where we're having a trial of a post-second term 82-year-old Donald Trump in 2029.
And ultimately, if that had to be decided in the courts, then it would go to the Supreme Court, and presumably the Supreme Court would side with him, one might imagine. It's fascinating stuff. I feel like I want to get on to organized crime, but given that we're pressed for time, I also just want people who might be confused by the 4 cases that you just threw down on the table to be able to pass those. Should we go in order of like severity /
let's do
plausibility?
That. Yeah, and by the way, I do this all the time. Anytime I'm on air with CNN and I start talking about these, I go, now this is the federal, because there's no way a normal human which I'm not, can keep this straight. 4 criminal indictments. 2 of them are federal, brought by DOJ, the special counsel Jack Smith. One of them relates to January 6th, although it's really more about the pre-January 6th.
Special counsel, just briefly, what's a special counsel?
So special counsel is when the Attorney General of the United States, let me take it back a step. Our president nominates the Attorney General, who then has to be approved by our Senate. So Joe Biden nominated the current Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who was a longtime judge and a former prosecutor before that, back at the beginning of his term. And then in certain extraordinary circumstances or where you may have a conflict of interest, the Attorney General has the power to appoint a special counsel. So Merrick Garland, about a year and a half into his term, appointed Jack Smith as special counsel. Robert Mueller was special counsel also, if people remember that. There's been a couple other.
Basically someone who's going to undertake a specific investigation that the Justice Department wants to be able to keep somewhat at arm's length or keep the illusion of political impartiality around.
You got it right on the head. Exactly. It's somebody who has a specific mission, and the purpose is to create that little bit of arm's length distance from the DOJ. So special counsel Jack Smith has 2 indictments. One of them relates to the effort to steal the 2020 election, sometimes called the January 6th indictment, although it really doesn't have to do with, he doesn't charge Trump with inciting the riot or anything like that. He charges him with basically a several month-long conspiracy to try to steal the election through fraud. So that's one, the most serious, I think. That one's based in Washington, D.C. There's a second federal case brought by Jack Smith for the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago and obstruction of justice. That one's in federal court, but in Florida, where, by the way, Trump is popular. He's very unpopular in D.C. with the populace, and he's very popular in Florida. Then we have 2 state-level cases. One of them was brought by the Manhattan, New York City district attorney for falsifying records of hush money payments that Trump made to Stormy Daniels, the adult film actress, in 2016. It's already 8 years old, this conduct. The Fed, I report on this actually in the book. The feds passed on this. The DOJ looked at this and they just decided the proof wasn't good enough. The conduct wasn't recent enough. The conduct wasn't serious enough. I lay out the inside reasons for it, which we can agree or disagree with. And then the final case comes out of Fulton County, which is Atlanta, Georgia, which also charges Trump with trying to steal the 2020 election. It doesn't really add much. It's very, if you were to graph the facts alleged by that case and Jack Smith's case, they would overlap substantially. So there's a fair debate here about whether that state level charge is necessary or appropriate, or whether it serves some other purpose beyond what Jack Smith's cases serve.
Could it? What would that purpose be?
Well, I think people say Trump cannot pardon himself from a state case, right? But he can pardon himself from Jack Smith's case, which is true, but it runs into the same problems I said before. If Trump becomes president again, he'll pardon himself from Jack Smith's case, and he probably is not triable by Fani Willis, by a county DA while he's in office.
Right.
Other people tried to say, well, the DA alleges different, before we saw the indictment, there were people saying, oh no, she's going to allege a different case, and then we saw the indictment. It's the exact same thing. I mean, it's packaged in the language of state charges rather than federal, but the conduct is almost entirely overlapping.
And the conduct, to clarify for people, is not conduct. The conduct is not the fact that Trump said, I think that there are shenanigans here. I don't think Joe Biden is the legitimate winner. We need to defend our country, and other things that might have incited people to protest and to violently attack the Capitol. The conduct that is being alleged that's illegal is what? So,
great point. Jack Smith could have charged insurrection, trying to overthrow the government. He did not. He could have charged inciting a riot, rallying up the crowd and be there, will be wild, and we're going to go down to the Capitol and show strength. He did not. And I think wisely. Those would have been really difficult because Trump also said, whether one believes he believed it or not, he probably didn't, but he did say, be patriotic and peaceful or something like that. What Jack Smith has charged Trump with is really a conspiracy and a fraud. To steal the election by falsely claiming that he won when he knew he didn't, by pressuring state, local, congressional officials to throw votes his way when he knew he had lost, by pressuring the vice president to throw out votes for Biden when he knew or should have known the vice president had no such power. So it's really, like I said, it's a misnomer to call it the January 6th indictment. It's really it's not as catchy, but, the election date up through January 5th indictment. In fact, Jack Smith's actual indictment only mentions the actual physical attack on the Capitol. It says Trump tried to leverage, it doesn't say Trump caused it. It says Trump tried to leverage the uncertainty that resulted from that attack in order to, accomplish his mission of stealing the election.
Right. And Trump's defenders, and presumably Trump's defense, say this is basically criminalizing speech. I mean, you're basically making it impossible for a wronged candidate to raise questions about the legitimacy of an election by using the tools of the state to punish dissent. And there are First Amendment rights in the United States to say whatever you want, and you're allowed to go out and say what you want. What's wrong with that defense?
I think that's absolutely one of the two defenses, and you stated it really well, Josh. I think the comeback, we have very broad First Amendment rights. You're allowed to lie. I mean, you can be sued for defamation at a certain point, but the First Amendment protects horrible speech. It protects, in many circumstances, lies. It protects, in many circumstances, dangerous language. We set the bar very high in the United States for where speech can become a crime in particular. And the type of speech that is entitled to the highest level of protection is political speech. So he will argue what you just said. This was political speech. I'm entitled to contest an election. I'm even allowed to lie. I can get behind a microphone and say I won and there's massive fraud. I mean, it's not great, but it's not a crime, he would argue. It's protected by the First Amendment. And Jack Smith takes this on. In the very first page of his indictment, he says, yes, there is First Amendment rights, but he argues that what Trump did sort of crossed the line into unprotected speech. I mean, not all speech is protected. If I tell you, Josh, hey, I'd like you to murder so-and-so, and I buried a gun outside your house, use that. That's all I'm doing is talking, but it makes me part of the crime. So the prosecutor, and this is what the jury will have to resolve. The other defense Trump's going to make is something along the lines of, look, I had advisors telling me I had lost the election, right? We saw it publicly. His attorney general said it's over. There's no fraud. Other responsible, important people told him you lost. But I also had other advisors telling me I had not lost and there was fraud and I needed to fight it. Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell. Now, a sound-minded person will go, how could you listen to Rudy and Sidney Powell? They're maniacs. People even call them team crazy versus team normal. I agree. I agree it's wild to listen to Rudy Giuliani or Sidney Powell. I agree that the reality was Trump, I'm sure, was just trying to cherry pick whatever advice he wanted to hear. But you get into the problem, he'll say, look, presidents get competing advice from their advisors all day long, every day. And if you're going to make it a crime for him, he doesn't always have to listen to the stodgiest voice in the room or the best educated voice in the room. Sometimes he can, he's entitled to listen to whatever. And he's got different groups of advisors telling him different things. He chose to trust group B rather than group A. Maybe history will judge him harshly for that, but is it a crime? I'm articulating his defense here. But I think, the comeback to that is he knew what he was doing. He was just looking for whoever would facilitate his lies and his fraud.
And why does he need to have known what he was doing? I'm a little bit hazy on that second defense, because if Rudy Giuliani says it's my professional legal opinion that you should kill so-and-so, and Trump goes and does it, then it doesn't change. The fact that he had legal advice doesn't change the fact that the conspiracy or the murder or the plot to steal the election or whatever that underlying allegation was legal.
So there are limits. We call this the advice of counsel defense, or Trump might try to make some sort of second cousin of that. But there are limits, including the advice can't be patently ridiculous that any normal human would realize is ridiculous. Like if your lawyer says, go ahead and kill that person, no sane-minded person would say, okay. But if you're getting into arcana of, was the election stolen? What rights do you have? Can you contest it? It's more arguable. But, and to your question, why does it matter if Trump knew he lost? Because you have to prove criminal intent. I mean, what if Trump genuinely thought he won? What if he did actually win? He did not. But what if he did actually win? Would his conduct here have crossed the line into criminal? I don't know. Again, he did not win. I believe he did not. I believe he knew he did not win. I believe he was putting on fronts and covers here, but I'm just sort of playing these arguments out for you.
I'm still unclear. So it does make a material. You do need a mens rea, so to speak, like a guilty mind. You need the person to be aware that they're committing a crime in order for it to be a crime in this case.
You need to know that what you're doing is wrong and unlawful. You don't need to show the person knew, well, the statute code number, whatever, I'm probably violating that now. But I mean, there are various ways you can prove mens rea, meaning a guilty mind. Some of the things Trump did, arguably, it doesn't matter whether he thought he won or not. Like, if you read his conversation, his famous conversation with the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who says, I need you to find 11,780 votes. If you read that as he's asking this guy to fabricate votes, it doesn't matter if Trump thought he won or lost. That's guilty mind anyway. There's some debate about whether that's actually what Trump was trying to say there, which we can get to if you want. But for a lot of the other stuff, pressuring Mike Pence, if Trump really believed that he lost the election and that there was fraud and that some of the states should be thrown out, is it criminal for him to say to the vice president, hey, we have I think some of those were wrong, were fraud, and you shouldn't count them I'm not saying it's a great defense, but this is, you do have to prove some wrongful state of mind. If he knew he lost and he pressured Mike Pence, you clearly have the wrongful state of mind.
Okay, that's interesting. That strikes me as somewhat bizarre in a way. Because the whole point of having a procedural process, of relying on systems and norms and rules and processes rather than just outcomes, is that you follow the processes. You should be able to run a democracy or a liberal democracy 1 million times over through 1 million elections, and some of them might be unjust, some of them might even go the wrong way, but everyone follows the processes and the rules, because over the long run, that's how you end up with the better result. You don't have individuals saying, well, I think the rules, are actually wrong here, so I want to circumvent it because I think in actual fact I should have won for this reason or that. That just gets too complicated. That's why the founding fathers write a constitution, everyone obeys the constitution, they follow the processes, and everyone, to me, that is the bottom line, regardless of whether it yields the correct result in every instance.
You're exactly right. And I think one of the prosecution's point is you're allowed to contest an election. You can go to court. You can demand recounts depending on the state and what the vote count is. And Trump did all those things. And even after they failed, he continued to take these outside the process questions. I think what Trump will argue is, no, he was within the process. Yes, he filed lawsuits and all that. You can lean on the look, there were people leaning on the vice president to do both things. There were people leaning on him to throw out the votes and people leaning on him to not throw out the votes. I think the people leaning on him to not throw out the votes were legally correct, but does that make the other side criminal? Or were they engaging in a sort of aggressive, maybe even frivolous reading of the law? Same thing with submitting the fake electors. You could say, well, that was a fraud. They were trying to deceive. But what they'll say is, no, we were just submitting them just in case we happened to win some of the court cases. We needed to have that piece of paper on the books. So, but this will be
just clarify. I agree this fake electors thing. So that is, that is probably the most damning wrinkle in all this to me, just to my uneducated ear. They tried to recruit people from states that might have gone either way. They recruited these people, and who were these people in order to do what?
So in 7 contested states that Trump lost closely, what they did, the way it's supposed to work is when states basically get to run and certify their own elections. And normally when a state's done, I live here in New Jersey, the governor, whoever it is, the secretary of state will fill out this official paperwork. Each state has a certain number of electoral votes. I think I should know this. I think in Jersey we have 16. And it'll just say, we, the people of New Jersey, our 16 votes go to candidate A or B. And here's the name of the electors, which is just ceremonial people who will vote for one side or the other.
And they will physically go to Washington, D.C.
Goes to the Senate,
January 6th, and they will vote on behalf of the people of that state.
Exactly. What Trump's people tried to do is in 7 states, they submitted forms which used basically the same language that I just told you. But instead of saying Joe Biden won our state, which he did, it says Donald Trump won our state. And here's the people who are going to be casting the electoral votes, however many number the state has, for Donald Trump. Now, on the face of it, I agree. I think it's one of the strongest pieces of evidence prosecutors have. It's false. Donald Trump did not win those states. The comeback has been, but again, those were contingency plans. We were putting in those paperwork. People have actually done this before in different scenarios, but said, in case, look, this one's contested, state of Arizona. And in case it turns out that Trump wins, these are going to be the electors. The problem is the forms don't say that. 2 of the 7 states do say these are just contingent forms in case we win, but the other 5 do not say that. So the fake elector scheme is in a way, in some ways, I think the strongest piece of evidence that prosecutors have here. Here's the other thing. You have to, as a prosecutor, tie Donald Trump to it. So it's pretty clear, the people who signed it were involved. It's pretty clear Rudy was involved. You're going to need someone to say, and Trump was involved and blessed this, which I assume they have. But it's not enough to just show this happened and it was for Trump's benefit. Right. You have to show Trump was involved somehow.
And did these electors, is there a date by which these forms need to have been submitted or signed that would give credence or credibility to the claim that they were contingencies, that they couldn't have been done after the fact?
There's a date. So our elections happen in early November. There's a date called the safe harbor date. It's December 14th, I want to say, somewhere around the middle of December. And by then, basically all disputes have to be resolved. So they have to. So I think what you're getting at, Josh, is right, that some of these certificates were submitted after all the lawsuits were done and over with, after any real hope for the Trump people should have been over. So therefore, it was really an attempt at fraud.
Right. And are those certificates signed by the governor of the state? Who do they have to be signed by?
So they're not signed by the governor. They're signed by the electors themselves, and then they're submitted to the state itself, like whatever the Secretary of State.
The electors are just people, aren't they?
They're normal. They're normal people. They're like low level.
Elector.
Yeah, well, they're basically like people active in the party or low level, but they've been charged in some of the cases. I mean, the people in Georgia, for example, again, I forget I think Georgia has 16 electoral votes. For some reason that I don't fully understand, the DA chose to charge, I think it's 3 of the 16 people. There are other states that have charged all their electors with crimes. I'm blanking on which ones. I forget, maybe Wisconsin or Michigan or something. But a couple of the states have charged their electors with state-level fraud crimes. Other states have not.
So who has the job of determining who's an elector and who's not? Is it the vice president?
I think it's up to the party apparatus of a state. It's kind of like an honorary thing. So like, the Democrat, again, to use New Jersey, the Democratic Party of New Jersey will say, if Biden wins, these 16 people, and it's like mayors and council people and maybe donors. It's an honorary thing. We'll say these 16 people are going to be our electors if we win. And the Republican Party of New Jersey will say, and if Trump wins, it'll be these 16 donors and bigwigs and local.
Right. And if both parties send in certificates claiming victory, is there a system of what happens, or is it? The state
has to certify. The state officials, the state secretary of state goes, this is the one we're stamping. And that's what happened with all 7 states. The state, whether it was, by the way, some of these states were run by Republicans, but they said, yeah, no, Democrats won, Biden won. Trump's team tried to get tricky and send their forms directly into the U.S. Senate without going through the state, without getting them stamped by the state and saying, oh, no, actually, we won. Count these.
So in a way, we were lucky that there weren't Trump hack loyalists in the Secretary of State offices in some of these states, because you could imagine a scenario in which a Republican governor and Republican Secretary of State signed the wrong certificate. I mean, just in order to get the Republican into power, even if their voters voted for the Democrat.
For sure. And I'll add to that. I mean, imagine if Mike Pence, the vice president at the time, had done what Trump was pressuring him to do. I mean, Trump was putting on a heavy blitz on him, borderline threatening him, that when you get up on January 6th, this is why January 6th is January 6th, that's when Congress gathers to officially count. It's always been, up until 2021, it was always just a ceremony. Not meaningless, but it's not a court trial. You just read the names. Mike Pence refused, but Trump wanted Pence to say, when he got to the first contested state, Arizona, on down the line, Pennsylvania, say, I reject these, because the vice president has the ceremonial role of basically just reading it out. And Pence refused. But what if, I mean, it's one of the great what ifs. What if Pence said, okay, and then he stood up on January 6th in the well of Congress and he said, okay, next up is Arizona, and I've rejected these votes because of fraud, and I send it back. We would have, I mean, people overuse, I think, the phrase constitutional crisis. I think I define a constitutional crisis as we don't know what happens next, because as many bad, crazy, strange things that happen, we can always go, okay, what happens next is you appeal to the Supreme Court. We wouldn't know what happened there. I mean, maybe you go to, I don't know, do you go to the Supreme Court? It boggles the mind. And so Mike Pence, and there was others who refused to go along with this plan, many of whom have now become witnesses in the January 6th committee and probably in these criminal trials too.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think that through. The Supreme Court needs a legal argument. Someone needs to have the standing to bring the case, and the case needs to have legal coherence. It's not good enough to say, but they're breaking the rules.
Right.
You need to point to the rule that they're breaking.
The Supreme Court's not just like a complaint desk, but you're right. You would need, I mean, I think my best guess is we collectively would have figured out some way to challenge what Pence had done in the Supreme Court if he did that. I think some state would have sued some other state. That's one of the ways, actually, that the Supreme Court can actually take a case immediately as like state versus state, saying we've been disenfranchised.
But you've only got 2 weeks between January 6th and the inauguration. So what happened? How quickly do they act?
Yeah, I mean, they'd have to. Judges and justices can act as quick as they want. I mean, with Bush versus Gore, they acted in a matter of days. They act like, they like to stand on ceremony and take their merry time. And sometimes people can't believe how long appeals take. But if that had happened, I suspect even this court with 6 conservatives would have said, no way.
Yeah,
Again, we're guessing here. And I guess they would have done it pretty quickly. But then the other side would have flipped out and said, oh, the Supreme Court just stole. I mean, would have been.
Yeah. So that's the strongest case. I don't think we need to go through all of them. I just want to touch on Stormy Daniels, and just to put a button on the free speech thing. If any listeners are somewhat persuaded by the idea that all he did was talk, he didn't really do anything other than say words, and that's protected under the First Amendment. I did hear a lawyer say to me, there are lots of crimes that are just talking. I mean, asking someone to kill your wife is just talking.
I just gave you an example. If I said to you, right. go do that. I'd like. Or, if I said to you,
tax fraud is people go to jail for cheating on their taxes. That's just speech.
If I said to you, Josh, you're going to have to pay me 10% of the proceeds from your podcast from now on, or else I'm going to send someone to break your knees. All I'm doing is talking, but that's not protected, right? I mean, the First Amendment's broad, but where speech itself sort of constitutes action, then it's not protected necessarily.
Yeah, got it. And then the weakest of the cases, the Stormy Daniels one, I've never understood this case. I think I was very disheartened when it became the first case that was brought against him.
Yeah.
I still don't really understand why here's my problem with it. So I think people understand the contours of this, right? He paid hush money to shut up a hooker who he'd slept with, and because it was during the election campaign, it's considered to be an illegal campaign donation, and he didn't register it, and so that's him donating to his campaign, or it being interpreted as him donating to his campaign. But my confusion here is that it's hard to say that he wouldn't have done it had he not been running.
Right. So
because he just wants to protect his reputation. So does the act of running for president deprive me of the right to do things that would burnish my reputation?
So that's exactly what he would say. So first of all, I should point out, Stormy Daniels is not. You said hooker. She's not a hooker. She's an adult film actress.
My
different.
Apologies.
No, it's okay. I just
Stormy. I love her.
But I mean, So Trump's team pays her off to silence her, which is not a crime, by the way. It happens quite a bit in this country. It's called catch and kill sometimes, where wealthy people pay for the exclusive rights to stories about them and kill them. And a lot of this, meaning don't run them. And a lot of this has only come to light the last 10 years or so. A lot of this came to light through reporting of people like Ronan Farrow and others on the way that Harvey Weinstein and other sexual predators paid off people with non-disclosure agreements and all that. Okay, that's not the crime. The crime, now you're right, Josh, that part of the crime is, well, it was really a campaign expenditure. It would have been over the limits that you're allowed to spend. It should have been reported as such. That's the crime. But that would have been the federal crime. And I report in the book about how DOJ very carefully looked at that, and agree or disagree, they decided not to charge it because as you said, there's too much. Part of their reason, and I got the inside story here, is they said, first of all, they have a bad history of doing this. They have a very low success rate. They brought a somewhat similar case against John Edwards, who had been a senator. He ran for vice president, and they lost that case because it's hard to prove. Because
he ran for president.
Right. He was, but sorry, wait. He ran for president. Then he was the VP candidate
yes.
With Kerry. Kerry was running for, right. So he was a VP candidate, and he was a U.S. senator from North Carolina.
2004.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as you say, so many things that any candidate does is designed to promote his candidacy. And can you really log it all as a campaign expenditure? What if he gets a haircut? It's meant to make him look better. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but there's a lot of gray area there. What New York State prosecutors did, the way they've charged him, is falsification of business records. So what they did is they got their hands on the Trump organization's internal records, and on the internal records, it doesn't say, hush money to porn star. It doesn't say, catch and kill money. It says legal fees. And so they argue that's false. They weren't legal fees. And so they were falsely booked, which on its own is a very low level crime in New York City. It's a misdemeanor in New York under New York state law, meaning a very minor crime. Nobody goes to prison for a misdemeanor. The way it's charged is as a misdemeanor. It only bumps up to a felony, the more serious type, but the lowest level. There's 5 layers of felony. A, the most serious, down through E. This would be an E felony if it violates campaign finance laws, as you say. And the problems with this case there's a lot of problems. One, the conduct is now 8 years old. That's a long time. And to take it from me, juries care less about things that happened longer ago. B, it's arguable whether Trump is responsible for the crime is the way these payments were booked. And if you listen to Michael Cohen, who's going to be, this is point C, the star witness here is Michael Cohen, who has all sorts of credibility issues. And I should say I'm friendly with Michael Cohen. I like him. We talk. We've gotten together socially, but he definitely has credibility issues. I mean, he's pled guilty to perjury. He's pled guilty to fraud. He's been caught. He despises Donald Trump. He openly hates him. The problem is Michael Cohen at one point made a tape recording of Donald Trump when he was representing Trump, and Trump didn't know it. And in it, Trump says something. They're talking about the Stormy Daniels payments, and Trump says, "How are we going to pay her, with cash?" And Michael Cohen says, No. Me and Alan Weisselberg, don't worry. Me and Alan Weisselberg are going to take care of it. Weisselberg was the CFO. So the defense goes, folks, who's responsible for booking these payments? The lawyer. Here you have Michael Cohen, their star witness, saying, me, the lawyer, and the CFO, we're going to handle how they're booked. You don't worry your head about it, Mr. Trump. So but I should say Trump is hated in New York County. I mean, I'm generalizing here, but he got something like 10% or 12% of the vote in 2020, which is astonishing. So, he's going to have a very unfavorable jury pool here. But even if he gets
the whole point of a legal system is that people who are hated and loathed and reviled are upheld and given fair trials and presumed innocent. I mean, there's something about this case that, to me, I just think if any Trump hater flips the script in their head and imagines that this was being done to their favorite candidate, this kind of persnickety, like filtering through all the details,
internal papers.
Exactly, that's right. And then we can up the crime because there's this other underlying thing, which is that you wanted to protect your reputation during a campaign. Like anyone who has run a business or who has, been in a stoush with the IRS or the tax office, knows that there's probably something on line 472B they filled in incorrectly, that if they had the kind of people hunting them that Donald Trump does, they could probably get in trouble. So I think this was a mistake, in my opinion, just from a PR perspective to bring. It feeds into the narrative, the Trump narrative of a witch hunt.
If you talk to Democratic operatives, people who've worked Democratic campaigns, Democratic White Houses, on Capitol Hill for Democrats, they hate this case. Like, some of them say it publicly on air. Like, they just think it's overreach. It plays into Trump's narratives. Like you were just saying, that people are just going, rifling through all his stuff, looking for anything. The fact that it was the first one that dropped, it was the first of the four, was not ideal. And if this is the first and perhaps only case that goes to trial, I mean, I think there's a legitimate question about whether it will even hurt him politically if he gets convicted. Like, there was polling recently where Trump was ahead of Biden by 2 to 5 points in, I think it's 5 different swing states. But they said, if Trump gets convicted and sentenced, would that flip your vote? And it flipped a few points, but a few points could be decisive here. It went from Trump beating Biden by 2 to 5 points to Biden beating Trump by 2 to 5 points. But I don't think the pollsters and I don't think the respondents were thinking of the hush money case. I think they were thinking of the Jack Smith cases, which are much more, the January 6th case and the classified documents case. I think if you specifically say, would a conviction in the hush money case make a difference? I think you have very few people who would say, I would have voted for him, but not if he's convicted in the hush money case. You do have a handful, small but potentially very important handful, who I think say, I would vote for him, but not if he's convicted of January 6th.
And look, as a political journalist myself, I'm very skeptical about polls like that, because I don't think they capture what people's response will be to watching the news every day or going through their social media feeds and seeing testimony from people. To me, what would be damaging to Trump would be relentless days of damning testimony about what was going on in December and January prior to January 6th. There would be the conviction is somewhat moot in a way in terms of the PR battle. If you spend September and October talking about his criminal enterprises, then you bring to the forefront of swing voters' minds the threat of having another 4 years of this asshole tinkering around with things, and maybe that just turns up the volume a little bit on that characteristic of his.
That's interesting because one of the odd features of this is we know so much, and a lot of the credit here goes to the Congressional January 6th committee, which held its hearings not this past summer of 2022. I mean, there's I forget how many pages, 800-page report. Like, there's very little that we don't know right now. Now, sure, prosecutors may find some new angles or new nuggets, but
right. But who's the we who's doing the knowing? I mean, you and I know this.
Yep.
Voters in elections in America are by definition decided by people who haven't been paying attention to this. That's why they're swing voters, because they don't have strong opinions one way or another, and they don't follow things very closely. They'll start following things in September, and whatever is swirling around in the news then will nudge them one way or another.
And important to keep in mind, if Trump's on a criminal trial, he has to be in the courtroom, so he will be physically removed from the campaign trail. And to your point, I think it's very unlikely that we see any of these trials carrying on in September, October, within November, because it's a rule to varying extents, written or unwritten, understood or whatever, that you don't do things as a prosecutor too close to an election that are likely to influence that election. Now, that rule's been compromised at times, famously by James Comey when he made two big announcements that were harmful to Hillary Clinton on the eve of the 2016 election. People have said he lost the election for Hillary Clinton, not my area to judge. But I don't see any realistic way a judge keeps Trump on trial through September and October, the heart of the general election, and confines him to a courtroom in whether it's Manhattan or DC or Florida. So I sort of, when you're looking at the calendar, I think the latest you can realistically start one of these trials, they're all going to take 2 to 3 months each, is July. I think once you get past July, you're into no man's land.
Right. Interesting. Okay. You've said a couple of times during this chat that things like, well, Trump didn't incite violence on January 6th because he included words like be peaceful, or he didn't, necessarily know.
I'm articulating that side. Yeah.
Yeah. Or he didn't necessarily know that the hush money payments were going out of the business because, that was Michael Cohen's decision. One of the fascinating things in your book, I think, is just to draw the line between this behavior and behavior that you grew up seeing in the mob. I mean, not grew up, but like,
well, hold on.
when you were cutting your, when you were a child mobster.
My dad made me sound like the son of Tony Soprano. Yeah,
exactly. When you were cutting your teeth, I mean, as a prosecutor, then this pattern of behavior that the mob, talk us through some of the characteristics that enable people to persistently break the law without breaking the law.
And I spent most of my time in the Southern District of New York as a mafia prosecutor. I was chief of organized crime unit at the end, deputy or co-chief, I should say, with another person. And I always get a little reluctant to say Trump's like a mob boss because it's almost become cliche. But man, so many times, and I'm not basing this on the movies. Like, I'm basing this on actual. And in the book, I draw parallels between actual cases I prosecuted and Trump's conduct. And man, oh man, does he understand the mobster's playbook. I mean, you just gave a couple examples, right? Always distance yourself. Always build in that layer of insulation. Never do the dirty work yourself. In the mob case, it might be on the books. It might be committing violence. But always have somebody else do it. And then have that person be somebody who, if they flip on you, they're a sleazebag. You can accuse them of horrible things. I'm not saying Michael Cohen's a sleazebag, but that'll be the accusation. Say it without. I have a chapter called "Say It Without Saying It." How really savvy criminals and bosses, and I give all these examples from my experience, know how to give their orders and instructions without saying, "Okay, Michael Cohen, I want you to falsify my books." They just go, do it in a way that I'll be okay or whatever. Do it in a way. Trump's really good at throwing in those little. Oh no, do it legal. Just what like. Michael Cohen has said this. He said, Trump never told us to inflate his assets, but we knew what the marching orders were. I quote the movie Goodfellas. There's a great scene that's very true to life where they're at the barbecue and the boss, Paulie, is sitting there and someone comes over and whispers in his ear and Paulie just nods at him. And the voiceover from Ray Liotta goes, for a guy who moved all day, Paulie didn't talk to 6 people because he doesn't need to say anything. He just nod. If you ever listen to real gangsters if we ever, we wiretap them sometimes with phones. We had a wiretap in a restaurant they ate at. They're more guarded on the phone than they are in person, but they'll never go, hey, did that guy go pick up the shakedown money from the butcher? Did that guy beat the crap out of this guy? They'll go, hey, did you see the guy about that thing? It's okay. All right. So Trump really knows how to speak in that ambiguous way. I'll tell you another one that I point out in the book that's really come true is everyone knows that rich people pay for these legal dream teams for themselves. We all remember OJ and Alan Dershowitz and all this. What real savvy bosses do is they pay for lawyers for other people around them. Not illegal. In fact, I criticize DOJ for loosening their policies and allowing that more and more over the years, but it makes it very difficult, right? Usually, unless and until that person can break away from in this case, Trump-funded lawyer, only then can they come clean. I mean, look at Cassidy Hutchinson. She's talked about this publicly, and again, I know her personally too.
Remind us who Cassidy was.
Cassidy Hutchinson was a White House staffer. She worked in the chief of staff's office, but she was in the West Wing throughout the build-up to January 6th and January 6th. On January 6th itself, she then testified very dramatically in Congress. And Cassidy has said when this all happened, she was given a Trump paid-for lawyer. That's undisputed. And she didn't feel like she could tell the full truth at that point. She was too scared. She didn't want word to get back to him. She didn't want to get punished. She couldn't pay for her own lawyer. And so she withheld intentionally certain details from Congress. Only when she managed through various difficult machinations to break away and get her own lawyer did she go back to the committee and say, okay, look, now I can tell you the full truth. Now I have this lawyer who really represents me. But I saw this all the time in the mob cases. I mean, bosses pay for everyone's lawyers. And I tell a story in the book about a case where we had a mid to lowish level guy who wanted to flip, but he couldn't because he had a mob paid for lawyer. So I won't give away the whole thing, but he sent his girlfriend to deliver a secret message to the FBI. And I had to go to the judge and do this like secret proceeding to get him what we call shadow counsel, which it's legal. But we basically had the court secretly appoint a different guy to go in and talk to him. And that lawyer came out and went, yep, you're right. He wants to flip. And then we pulled him out of jail and put him in a safe house.
You have to smuggle him out through a tunnel or something.
We did. There's a whole system of tunnels.
It's a great section of the book. I mean, and it was eye-opening to me, really eye-opening, that you say that there's essentially a cabal of lawyers who are on the pay of the mob and who are appointed, and the poor, lowly, criminals who work for the mob don't have any other option and don't necessarily know that the lawyer is working against their interests.
Well, in the mob, they know what's up. Like they know, they know who's paying. They know they're not paying. Right?
Well, they know they're not paying, but I think they may be naive about the extent to which the lawyer is betraying them. I mean, you make the point that the lawyer may not even present them with the option that there's a deal. There may be a deal that could be struck that the lawyer instructs them not to take. Yeah, because the mob bosses obviously don't want them to flip. But
in my experience,
they're not aware that the lawyer is necessarily working against their interest, are they?
In my experience, they get it. They understand. Right, okay. If they're around the mob, they're told, hey, this guy, John Jones is going to be your lawyer. Making up that name. If there's anyone named John Jones out there, I apologize. They know what's up. And they know. And in fact, in our cases, I would do cases where we charge 20, 24, 27 defendants at once, all gangsters. We knew and they knew that nobody was allowed to plead unless the boss signed off. So even if we made a sweetheart, forget about cooperating. I just mean plead and get out of the case. That wasn't allowed and if the boss said you're pleading, and they didn't want to, they're pleading. This is not a consensual situation.
And is that because they have an ethic of being loyal to the team and not ratting out, or is it because they're terrified of getting whacked if they betray the mob?
There's a well-established playbook. When you have a case, nobody does anything unless and until it's approved by the boss. All the lawyers will speak for the boss. The boss will speak through those lawyers or whoever the highest ranking guy is.
Doesn't the lawyer have a legal and ethical obligation to represent the client, not the boss?
Yes. So I actually talk about this in the book. There were a certain brand of lawyers who I'll not call mob lawyers because they get offended. But I'll tell you one example. There's a guy who I know who's still around. I actually talked to him recently, who's been trying criminal defense cases for at least 50, let's be careful here, 40 years now. He's never once brought in a client to cooperate. Now, a lot of people cooperate in the federal system. I mean, and it's almost always the safest option, right? If you were to do a bar graph of outcomes, people who go to trial usually fare the worst. People who just plead without cooperating do better, and people who cooperate get the best deals. How is it possible? This guy's represented literally thousands of people over 40 years, and nobody's ever cooperated with him. And some of these guys, this guy in particular says proudly, I don't do rats. This is his language. because and I think this is a breach of their ethical duty. You're not representing if you are not even presenting your client with one of three options, the best of three options often, because you want to protect your own standing, your own ability to keep getting mob cases, I think that's absolutely an ethical violation. And I say it in the book. I say nobody seems to ever want to do anything about it, judges or prosecutors or whatever. I mean, look, I never had a fit about, when I was a prosecutor, I never went to a judge and was like, oh, judge, because they're just going to go, judge, look, I do what's best for my client in any individual case, and I assess the circumstances, and they can't force me to cooperate with anybody. It's just like an unprovable case. But after 40 years of no cooperators, that's mathematically impossible.
I'm surprised that there's not a polite society of lawyers that they get booted out of.
It's really, well, they kind of do. I mean, they're not, you're known as a mob. It's always funny because we know who I say in the book, if we were going to arrest 22 guys the next day, I would be able to predict who 19 of those lawyers would be. I won't name the names, but if you look at it, pull up any of my old docket sheets, you'll see the same defense names over and over and over, because they have their stable of approved lawyers and they're known as mob. The funny thing is, like, most of those guys get very offended if you call them mob lawyers. I did an episode of my podcast with one of them, Murray Richmond, who represented a boss in a murder case I did. And I say, like, are you offended by the phrase mob lawyer? He's like, no. It's like, why would I? That's what
It's a fair descriptor of precisely what I do. I know you have to go, and we've established that if Trump wins the election, then probably all of these legal problems go away. If Trump loses the election, just put on your prognosticator's hat for us. What happens? Great question, and not enough people are thinking about this. So let's say he's been tried once or twice right before the election. Those cases will proceed to sentencing, and then he'll get to appeal. And then, look, there's a possibility. Not likely. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's likely. I'm interested. Tell me what you think, Josh. Do you think if Trump loses the election and we get to, and Trump goes through one or more of these trials and he gets convicted and he gets sentenced to prison and it stands up on appeal, and here we are in, let's say, 2027, right? We're right in the middle of a second term Joe Biden's presidency, and Joe Biden is 84 and Donald Trump is 80. And now there's nothing left between Donald Trump and prison. Do you think Joe Biden would not pardon him, but commute his sentence? Meaning, I'm not wiping out your conviction, but I'm going to eliminate your sentence and you're going to do home probation or whatever, home confinement or probation. I'm interested in what you think, because people vary on this. That is fascinating.
What do you think?
Fascinating.
Can you see it?
Thought experiment. I can absolutely see it, and I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know. I mean, I can totally see it happen either way. It depends what the climate of American politics is like. It depends how good artificial intelligence is at swamping us with misinformation, how divided we are. If the left continues to be if the left gets more exercised by social justice mobs, I don't think it'll be possible for him to do that. And if the left calms down and swings back towards a more Bernie Sanders economic justice agenda, then I think he could get away with being the bigger guy and doing
interesting.
But it's really hard to know.
Well, I will tell you, I've asked that question of a lot of people, and there's, I think a lot of people can see it either way, but I will tell you, the people who I know who have worked with and for Joe Biden are almost uniformly on the, I can see that happening side.
Like, I can certainly see it happening. I can certainly see it happening. Yeah. The idea of,
but I was going to say, there's another question of, if Trump loses the election, and let's say he's been tried once, how many of these trials are we actually going to see to fruition? Like, let's say he gets tried in D.C. for January 6th, Jack Smith, gets convicted, loses the election, gets sentenced to whatever. Then after, now we're into 2025, he's lost, and he's been convicted, and now we do the other Jack Smith case, the Mar-a-Lago case, and he gets convicted or not again. Are we going to really do all four of these? Like, if two or three of them are after, and he's already been convicted, there comes a point where prosecutors might say, okay, enough's enough. He's lost the election. He lost 2024. His political career is over. He's been convicted once or twice, and we don't see a need to have a third and a fourth trial and put everyone through this and yet again and again.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah.
And the sentencing, just on the question of the commutation, of the Biden commutation, that depends on the sentence being actual jail time. What options would the judge have Presumably there's house arrest and things like that, so that he doesn't have to go into a federal penitentiary.
So there's two levels. So the entity that sets the sentence is the judge. In either of the two federal cases or the Fulton County case, I think if he's convicted, we're looking at very likely sentence of some imprisonment. The New York case, even if he's convicted, I think we're looking at probation or something like that. What if there's going to be a commutation? The president, let's say Biden, that's who it would be if it's not Trump, has the power to say, okay, you were sentenced to, let's say, 3 years in prison federally. I'm going to reduce that to no prison, but just probation, or no prison, but just home confinement or something. So he can take it down to wherever he wants. He could say, rather than 3 years, I'm going to make you do 6 months. So he has a lot of latitude if he is getting into commutation. Pardon would be wiping the whole thing out. I don't think a pardon's likely, but I think if there's going to be anything, it'll be a commutation.
Okay. There's a whole other conversation about whether the presidential pardon and commutation power is just, because I don't think it is. I think the justice system should be the justice system, and the executive branch should deal with the executive issues. Yeah. And never the twain shall meet. But I know you've got to go. Great to talk to you. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you, Josh.
Stuff.
Great to talk to you. I appreciate it.